Okay, well, hello, Anette.
Hello, John.
And I wonder if you can start by just introducing yourself and telling us where you work.
Yes, I'm from Denmark, and I work at a private educational institute, and we do educations in narrative therapy counseling. I've been doing that for many years. I work as a teacher, and then I work half of my time I do therapy sessions.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I wanted to interview you because I know that you do quite a lot of work with people who have experienced trauma.
Yeah, that's true.
And I wanted to ask you a little bit about that work. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So tell me about what got you interested in that kind of work.
Yeah. I think I've been interested for quite some years, but the interest increased 5 or 6 years ago when I started to work more intensively with women that's been sexually abused when they were children.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a part of a national project to try to help those women more.
Mm-hmm.
And lots of things happen. I learned a lot. I've been learning. I'm still learning a lot about trauma from my conversation with these women.
So what do you how do you do that kind of conversation, and what to you is important to focus on when you meet with someone who has been subject to some kind of trauma?
Yeah, quite many things important, and maybe I just want to say one thing first, that
Okay.
what I found out when I started to be interested in trauma and started to talk to people about that. What I found out was that many people think that only specialists can talk about trauma, that only very high educated trauma psychologists or therapists are the ones that are supposed to talk about that. And I think all the people I've been having conversation to have tried to talk when they were kids to somebody, but never the specialist.
Yes.
So they have been trying to talk to a school teacher, maybe a neighbor, maybe a nurse if they've been at a psychiatric hospital, and almost all of them has that experience that the people they tried to talk to didn't respond.
Mm-hmm.
And when I ask professionals about that, what they say is that they are afraid.
Mm-hmm.
They're afraid that they can't do it.
Mm-hmm.
They're afraid that they're not supposed to do it. Actually,
They might harm somebody.
They might harm, and what I hear mostly here is that they're afraid that other professionals will find that they're unethical, because this is only work for very skilled, very...
What would your clients say about that?
What I had talked to a woman yesterday. When she was 19, she met a nurse at a psychiatric hospital, and at one point the nurse told her, she said, I know what this is all about. You know what this is all about. You need to talk to the psychiatrist about that. And what she said was that I thought that what had happened to me was so bad that she couldn't hear it.
So she took it as being a fault in her, a bad thing about in her, or about
so bad
her.
that nobody can stand or are able to listen to this.
Yes.
So of course she didn't tell anybody else. And I think that's mainly the reaction, that when you're not listening to what the child will feel, is that this is so bad nobody can hear it. I got to keep it to myself. And
so for people who are starting to work with people who have experienced trauma, what would you suggest is the most important starting place?
The most important part is to appreciate that people actually want to talk to you about that. That is always a sign of trust.
Yes.
People don't go to the experts. They go to the people they trust, and where they have a sense that they will be listened to. So what's most important is to see whatever people are telling you, to see that as a sign of a protest against the trauma, and as a sign of trust that you will listen to it.
Even just telling you is part of the counter story.
And then that's it. Just telling it is a very, very strong counter story. And even though if it's not the first time, it's still a counter story. You still have a sense that somebody should hear this. And if you have a sense that somebody should hear this, you have a sense that something that's been going on is not right.
Mm-hmm.
So even though you don't have ideas on how to talk about the content of the trauma,
Mm-hmm.
you can always talk about the process of telling.
Yes.
So there's always this part of what made you tell me this.
Okay.
What were you able to believe in? What were you able to see that made you want to tell me this? What kind of step was it for you to tell me this? Was it a difficult thing for you to do? What made you do it anyway? What's important for you in regard to telling somebody about this?
Mm-hmm.
What's the hope connected to that?
In other
What's
words,
the
you talk
skills?
about the person taking the step
Exactly.
rather than the content of the trauma.
You can talk about taking the step to tell. It's a very important counter story. You don't even, if you don't feel maybe in the beginning of your counseling career, you don't feel content to go into the
trauma itself.
The trauma itself. You can always talk about the process of telling, and then you can talk about who else should know about this. What are the ways to go from here?
Mm-hmm.
And that is a very strong counter story. Mm.
So how would you build the counter story from that starting point?
So that could be the starting point, and then what's been very, very important in my work with trauma is to look for responses.
Mm-hmm.
People that's been traumatized because of the effect of trauma, the story that comes out of that is stories of not being able to do anything, by being overwhelmed by the power of the people that's doing whatever they're doing to you.
Mm-hmm.
But we know from narrative practice that there can't just be one story. There's always different stories, and we know that there's always resistance.
Yes.
And I like also the way you talk about that there's always responses. That's things you've been doing. You can't not have a response in regards to trauma.
Mm-hmm.
You just don't see it like that yourself. I talked to one woman that she had one incident of abuse by her father, and what she did, that was when she was 8 years old. What she did was she wrote a small note, just putting on the date.
Yes.
And put it behind her mirror, and then she actually forgot about the incident.
Mm-hmm. Like, you mean that helped her to forget? Or not?
I don't think it helped her. It helped her to remember. But she
Okay.
had a sense, what she said, I had a sense that something should be remembered.
Okay.
But for many, many years, I didn't think about the incident, but I
Okay.
knew about the note.
Yes.
And then when we started to talk about her whole story, that note became very important, because that was like a resistance that's always been there.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
that she saved her whole life. So it's
Like
like
it
a
reminded
lifeline.
her that back then I stood against this
Exactly.
in some little way.
I knew that something here. There was something here that shouldn't be forgotten.
Right. Okay.
And I did an action.
That shows
not
that
to forget.
this deserves to be remembered as an injustice.
Exactly.
You mean? Is that right?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. And I always found little things that people's been doing as resistant. But even before that, because sometimes you get the answer that people will tell you that I couldn't do anything. There was nothing to do. I didn't do anything.
Yes.
Then I can ask people how did you survive? How did you get places of a little freedom, places where places away from the circumstances that were so hard?
Mm-hmm.
And then people start telling story about a pet animal.
Okay.
They start telling story about a lot of stories about going outside, going out in the woods.
Yes.
Here we have lots of beaches, going
Yes.
along the beach. People tell stories about connections to books.
Okay.
We have in our country lots of libraries, where free libraries, people go and sit. A lot about connection to music. So, and then I go into those stories about what kind of music, what kind of books, about the character of the persons in the books, and start to work on those connections and and in what way that was a help,
Mm-hmm.
and how that gave hope or gave ideas about that life could be different.
Yes.
And you see that how that's a counter story, that what's happening to me is not everything that's possible.
Yes. Okay.
Other ways of living is possible. Maybe not now, maybe later.
Yeah, so it's a connection to some sense of living that is different from that is defined by the trauma.
Exactly.
Mm.
Yeah.
And it sounds like some of those are kind of solitary things that people do on their own, is that right? So a lot of them.
But I don't think you're on your own if you're with a book, or if you're at the beach, or so. So there's still a relation.
Yes. Okay.
And I work quite a lot on those relations. So I talk to
you look for the relation.
I think everything's relational. So
Yes.
even though you're on your own, you're still in relation with something.
Mm-hmm.
And like people that will use, for instance, the beach or the water or a tree,
Mm-hmm.
they talk about that as a relation. What is it the tree understand? What is it?
Okay.
And of course, if it's an animal,
Mm-hmm.
you have lots of relations to work on.
Yes.
But
Yes.
even the books, what is it that books know about life? They
Okay.
know that life can't just be one way. They know.
Or the characters in a book.
And the character knows something, and so I find actually that people have connection. One woman I talk to right now, she discovered how as a child she was playing a very small flute,
Mm-hmm.
and when she plays that flute today, she got back to it and started to play it. She felt connected. Her life comes together through the flute.
Okay.
Because you see that what trauma does is that it is breaking up your life, so you don't have that sense of being yourself all through your life,
Mm-hmm.
and it aliens your sense of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And trauma work can actually bring back a sense of connectedness or being yourself back through life all the way back. So
Mm-hmm.
so she was, or maybe connection to books. You can find, if you have a connection to a book when you're 6 or 7, you can talk about how that connection lived all through your life up till
Okay.
now. So it's like trauma didn't manage to break your connection to the books,
Yes. Okay.
and in that way your feeling as a person is not being put into pieces. It's sort of it, and that connection, that sense of continuity, is very, very important.
Mm-hmm.
To be able to feel whole as a person,
Mm-hmm.
not feeling being cut into parts.
So that's how you build the story of difference, or the counter story.
Exactly.
Not
Exactly.
necessarily through the trauma itself, but through other experiences of life that people have held back from the effects of the trauma and not allowed it to be defining of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then after that, it's not that I don't go into the specific episodes.
Mm-hmm.
I do that also to look for difference.
To look for difference.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. It's very important is that people need a place to stand to be able to do that, or else
Yes.
they'll sort of be maybe too overwhelming.
Yes.
And the stories around responses, the stories about in a way what trauma didn't manage to break in your life.
Mm-hmm.
Those stories will give you a platform
Mm-hmm.
where you can stand, where you can feel as a whole person,
Yes.
to be able to go into the more difficult parts of what actually happened in the trauma.
Okay.
But you don't need to have all those skills to be able to talk about trauma. You can just look for responses in the actually telling of it, and then you can look
Yes.
for responses or places that made you survive in a way.
Yes. Okay.
That made you able to breathe even though
Yes.
trauma was going on.
Yes.
And all that